In CarX Street, you can't simply go to the gearbox section and start tuning. Before doing that, you need to check your engine graph and wheel sizes, as these two factors play a big role in setting up your gearbox. I know it might sound complicated, but I'll explain it in the simplest way possible. Let's understand a few basics. The main purpose of a gearbox is to control the power and speed output from the engine to the wheels. Keep in mind that each engine has its own unique power graph, and this video will focus on the transmission, not the engine. The blue graph represents engine torque, while the white graph shows horsepower. According to the power graph, your second and third gears should start around 5,000 revolutions per minute for better grip during launch and when exiting corners. However, that's not where your engine produces maximum horsepower. That's why your fourth, fifth, and sixth gears should start around 6,000 RPM, where the engine produces peak horsepower, allowing for a higher top speed. As I mentioned earlier, each engine has a different power graph, so you need to find the optimal points for the best output from your gearbox by carefully reading the power graph. Even though this engine has great torque around 4,000 RPM, however, the horsepower isn't quite strong enough at that point. I found it works better to set the second gear to start at around 5,000 RPM, where torque and horsepower are more balanced. Here's some examples. Keep your eyes on the tachometer. And as I just mentioned, all stock cars with stock engines and stock transmissions already come with that configuration from the factory. This means that as long as you haven't swapped the engine or transmission, you don't need to adjust the gearbox. You can leave it as is or increase the ratio for better power output. However, higher ratios will require larger wheels to handle the increased power. But if your car is a rear-wheel drive, you might want to decrease the first gear ratio to balance power output. But why all-wheel drive and rear-wheel drive is different? All-wheel drive cars distribute power to both the front and rear wheels, while rear-wheel drive cars only send power to the drive wheels. This often results in too much power on the rear tires, making them more prone to slipping. That's why it's important to balance the power output. Now, what if you swap the engine or transmission? First, you need to test drive the car and see how it performs. In most cases, the gears start at 5,000 revolutions per minute, which seems fine. However, after checking the power graph of this car, I realized it should actually start at 5,500 revolutions per minute. So I went back to the tuning shop and adjusted the gearbox. You might have noticed that the first gear ratio was set to low. Setting the first gear ratio to low can cause a slower launch. However, it only feels slow with regular gas. Actually, I had tuned the gearbox for sport gas. Now, let's see how it performs with sport gas. Alright, before we set the gears, let's see how to adjust the final drive based on wheel sizes. You should use a higher final drive ratio for better acceleration in circuit racing, and the opposite for achieving higher top speed. However, if you use the biggest rims and the lowest first gear ratio, but your wheels are still slipping when launching, which normally happens in Class 6 cars, you will need to decrease the final drive ratio. After you know all the things that might affect your gearbox setup, you're now ready for gearbox tuning. Let's take a look at first gear. You usually use first gear for launching. If your car is all-wheel drive, you should increase ratio, but if your car is not all-wheel drive, you should try to balance power around the middle. Now take a look at the second gear. Keep in mind that you're now adjusting the gear ratio. The next gear you are about to set will be heavily affected by previous gear. As I showed you earlier, if it's lined up, the gear will start around 5,000 RPM. If you increase the second gear ratio, it will start with higher RPM. But if you decrease the second gear ratio, it will start with lower RPM. But if you already increase the first gear ratio to highest, you won't be able to increase the second gear ratio, and your second gear will start around 5,000 RPM. You will only be able to decrease second gear ratio. So the only way to increase the second gear ratio is to decrease the first gear ratio. This also applies to the other gears. For a clearer picture, here are some more examples as well. As I mentioned, the next gear you are about to set will be heavily affected by previous gear. Alright, what about how I set up the gearbox for my cars? Since you've already seen my 40Z and P91 gearboxes, I'll show you my M46 LMH and DX7 gearboxes. However, my cars are used for circuit racing, which is why my final drive ratio is set to the highest. But what if you want to do sprint races with a higher top speed? Don't worry, I've got some experiments for you. However, I want to show you some experiments on final drive ratios based on wheel sizes first. The top speed final drive ratio will come after that. As you can see, the 19-inch wheel can perform the same as the 22-inch wheel if you balance the final drive ratio with the wheel size. But there's something interesting about the top speed final drive setup. A smaller rim definitely provides a faster launching speed, but you'll be surprised in the end. I thought the bigger rim would hit 270 kilometers per hour first, but it turns out the smaller rim is the winner. Maybe it's because my car is classified as Class 3. In some cases, a low final drive might not always be the best for top speed. The only way to find out is to test it. However, within the same class, to reach top speed, you'll need more engine power, while a lighter weight is best for better cornering. And if you're going to swap the transmission, here's a quick guide. For clutch and gearbox upgrades, just go for the ultimate parts. It's the best choice. However, it's a bit different for the differential. The differential can affect oversteer and understeer, but don't worry, I've already made a video about it. And if your engine graph isn't showing, just tap on any of these. There it is. You see, setting up a gearbox isn't that simple. I hope this guide helps make it easier for you. It did take quite a bit of time to make this video, so I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Alright, I think that's it for today. Thanks for watching. See ya!